Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Neil Stokes. I'm a librarian with the Los Angeles Public Library's digital content team. And I want to thank you for joining us for another, hopefully very exciting streaming program today. We are very honored to be joined by David Judson, author of the new book, Innovation in Stained Glass. I'll tell you a little bit about David. He is the president and owner of Judson Studios, a fifth generation family member to operate the company that was founded in 1897. He's been involved in the studio since 1996 and has overseen hundreds of projects, both nationally and internationally, from Los Angeles to Dubai to Shanghai. In 2007, he became the owner and president of Judson Studios. In 2015, David expanded Judson Studios operations to a second facility near the original Garvanza headquarters to incorporate fusing capabilities to the firm's offerings and open the studio to fine artists, designers, and architects working in glass. David is also president of the Stained Glass Association of America, a board member of UFC's Roski School of Art and Design and the Ruskin Art Club, having served previously on various other boards, including Pasadena Heritage. And he is joining us today from his home in Pasadena. Hello, David.
Hello, Neo. Good afternoon.
It's so nice to have you here, and I'm going to bring up your presentation if you'd like to take over.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, everybody, for joining today. I hope you'll find this talk kind of interesting for a lot of reasons. One of them is obviously the history of stained glass, not only of the Judson Studios, but really of Los Angeles. And this talk I put together to kind of show off a little bit some of the stuff that's in the book that I recently published. And it's really kind of not only a history of the company, but a history of the city of Los Angeles. That was one of the most interesting things that I found in studying the book, was how the company changed and how the projects changed based on what was going on in the city, whether it was, you know, a boom time or a bust time or a world war or a depression. And so all of those things kind of reveal themselves in this story, so to speak. So firstly, I want to thank Angel City Press for taking on this project. It's been exciting to work with them and their knowledge of the city of Los Angeles. And so it was a great fit for Judson to work with Angel City Press. And I want to thank Neil and the Public Library for setting up today's talk. So I grew up around stained glass, obviously. I in fifth generation, as Neil mentioned, and the company's been around since 1897. And so I really didn't know anything different than stained glass. And so for me, it's been kind of an exploratory thing to kind of see how stained glass really fits in the world. And you know, in today's world, even, you know, the kind of contemporary thoughts about stained glass. And one of the reasons I call it innovation in stained glass is because of what we've been doing recently in the studio, which is very different from you know, what's been done in the past. And I think is really a major shift, in a paradigm shift, basically, you could say, in the world of stained glass. And I think it's coming. And so I want to share that with you. But a lot of the book is about the history of the studio. And so I want to start there and ask you a question and say, what comes to your mind when you think about stained glass? You know, one of the things I find about stained glass, and I meet people, and they, you know, I tell them I'm involved with stained glass, and everyone, it seems, has some kind of association with stained glass. You know, whether you've tried it yourself, maybe parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle. It's funny. Everyone has kind of this association with stained glass, you know, in a degree of separation. And so stained glass has this kind of, it resonates with people. It's a beautiful art. And it has something that a lot of exposure, not only because you don't just see it in in galleries or museums, but really you see it in architectural settings. And so that's where, you know, you may have grown up, say, in a religious space where you observe stained glass, or maybe you saw it in homes or a historic home that you lived in or something like that. But anyway, stained glass has probably touched you. And so what I want to do today is kind of change your perception of stained glass. And I hope I can kind of introduce you to things that may change your kind of preconceived notion of what stained glass is. So here's a window. I start with this window. This was done by Tim Carey, who is our designer for a number of years at Judson Studios. And in 2010, he made this window, fairly conventional window, religious in nature, very well painted and heavily painted. And it's kind of what you think of when you see stained glass, at least a lot of us. And so I like to compare that with this window, which was built basically in the same year. And it was done by an artist named Scott Parsons, who's out of the Midwest and the United States, but he has all of his work fabricated in Germany. And so for me, having grown up in a fairly traditional stained glass studio, seeing work like this on the left, was something to me that was very intriguing and interesting. And I felt, wow, this is something that I really like to get involved with. But this kind of goes back to the story of Judson and then also kind of what happens in Germany and more recently in terms of how stained glass is being fabricated. And the German studios are doing very contemporary work, like you see here, where ironically the United States and even here in California, we're doing a lot of traditional work. So I want you to remember these two images. So like I said, I grew up around stained glass. We attribute the founding of our company to William Lees Judson. This is him in front of the building. He's kind of a Mark Twain, resembles Mark Twain a little bit. But as you can see, a very kind of proud and formal guy. He came to California in 1893. Basically, he was told by his doctors to find kind of a warm place to die. But he came to Pasadena in 1893. He didn't die until 1928. And I always say that's what California does for us. We have a tendency to find new life here. It's kind of the state of renewal, right? California. Judson was a plein air painter, one of the earliest plein air painters in the area. And he settled in Pasadena, and then he couldn't afford to live in Pasadena, so he found a home over in Garvanza, which is in northeast LA. But what attracted him was the Arroyo Seco, right? So the Arroyo Seco attracted a lot of artists, and Judson among them, and he fell in love with the Arroyo and spent a lot of time in the Arroyo painting. And this is actually a painting looking kind of north, almost directly due north. That's the Hawley Street Bridge. That hill on the right-hand side, if you go over that, would have been or would be today the Rose Bowl. Right, so the painting was kind of his passion. He couldn't afford, like I said, to live in Pasadena, so he found a nice home. You see that home there on the left-hand side with kind of the tower. That was his home in Garvanza on the edge of the Arroyo. So this is looking kind of northwest from the Arroyo, looking into northeast Los Angeles up to the San Gabriel Mountains up there beyond, before the 110 freeway, I should say. And he picked this location. It was right next to the red car. The red car ran from Pasadena down to LA. I think it might have even gone to either Long Beach or Santa Monica. I can't remember now. But the red car ran right by his house that he built there. And so he was able to get to Pasadena and LA fairly easy and quickly. One of the earliest things that Judson did was to start the School of Fine Arts for USC. And so he was the first dean of the school. The school built its first building, which you see here, in 1900, in that same spot. So just that picture that I showed you of the train, the red car, this red car ran right along the ivy there that you see in the foreground. And so it was a great location because you could get to and from Pasadena and Los Angeles. And it was also kind of a fairly reasonable place to buy real estate. And this is really where the arts world kind of started in Los Angeles. And this is the first kind of university level school. And it's also the home of the Arroyo Guild. So not only was it a school, but it was called the Arroyo Guild of Fellow Crafters. And this was a movement of craftspeople that got together to sell their wares. And so if you're familiar with the craftsman movement, Stickley in New York was publishing the Craftsman, which was kind of the publication. And this was the Arroyo Guild's attempt at kind of doing a regional Southern California publication called the Arroyo Craftsman. And you see the symbol there of the wecan and the rising sun and the hammer. And this was unfortunately volume 1, number 1, and the last volume of the series. And so they were much better craftsmen than they were publishers. But this is an interesting, I republished this a number of years ago, and it's a really interesting insight to really the philosophy and kind of the movement of the arts and crafts community here in Southern California. Now, that was in 1909, and in that same year, later in that year, the building that I showed you previously burnt down, and this was the building they rebuilt, and it was a little bit larger. It had dormitories on the upstairs, so those upstairs windows that you see, those would have been dormitories for the female students. And this was designed by Train and Williams. And Train and Williams were the arts and crafts, the Royal Guild architects, kind of the official architects of the Royal Guild. And Train and Williams did a lot of arts and crafts houses around Los Angeles. They designed Angel's Flight. You're probably familiar with Angel's Flight. And so this design, I'm sure they worked with Judson to come out. It's a little bit of a hodgepodge of things. You know, it's a little Victorian with the rounded front there. There's some Islamic motifs, arts and crafts with the shingles, and then the arroyo stone at the bottom. And then you see some of the more decorative elements, terracotta above the front door, and some cement tracery at the roof line. So this was a very interesting building, and we're still there. And this remained the school until 1920, when USC started centralizing its campus. And here's a great shot of an early class photo. As you can see, mostly women studied fine arts at that time. So it kind of captures, I think, the exciting environment that these folks got to work in. But today's focus primarily is on Judson's sons, who started Judson Studios. And so William Lee started the School of Fine Arts, the Royal Guild, and then Judson Studios, and was very involved. He was just one of those guys. So that rather than coming out to die, he got very busy. And so Judson's sons started officially Judson Studios in 1897. They'd come out 2 years after him. So Judson came out in 1893. His sons came out in 1895. They worked for another local glazier and then started their own firm in 1897. And this is a shot of them in the original building, as you see in front of the original building. And that guy with the great mustache, that's my great-grandfather, Walter Horace, and his two brothers, Paul in the front and Lionel in the back there. So some of the earliest commissions were for local folks around Pasadena. This is the Phineas Mansion on Orange Grove. So if you're familiar with Pasadena, Orange Grove was Millionaire Mile. And this was one of their first commissions, as what they called themselves originally was a colonial art glass company. And so this house just blows me away that this was on Orange Grove in 1897. If you go inside, you see the skylight there above the kind of the central atrium of the building. That amazing peacock. I think that's a stuffed peacock. I don't think it's a live peacock, but it's great to see. And there it is looking up at it. So when I was doing research on the book, the Pasadena Museum of History came and said, hey, we found these great documents. And so this was really exciting because this is the first time that we'd seen an actual colonial glass, art glass commission. And so we were very lucky to have the museum find these and share them with us. Judson did a lot of arts and crafts work. Obviously, this is the Abbey San Encino. So if you know the Abbey, it's actually in Highland Park, very close to Judson Studios. And this window was made for Brown, the initial CB there in the bottom right. And Clyde Brown was one of the earliest printers in the city. And so this window, the story goes that this window was made in exchange for some promotional print material for Judson Studios, and the window's still there. A little bit later, you see this is a what we call American art glass design, which is of opalescent glass, which means that there's a little whiteness to it, and it's less transparent. And this is how you would associate with like Tiffany Studios. And so Judson did some of these landscapes in that period, the early teens. These were for Inglewood Mausoleum, and they're still there. And I'm going to show you these a little bit later in my talk as well. But these are really simple but beautiful, elegant windows that are kind of framed by the mausoleum halls, and it's a beautiful space. So that's some of the early work. Also, opalescent glass. If you haven't been in the dome at the Natural History Museum, it's fantastic. This dome done originally in 1914, which at that time would have been the Fine Arts Building. And so all of the kind of art and cultural events were happening in this building at that time. And Judson also did the globe of being held there by the muses. There's actually 3 of them. And this space, if you walk in and look up, it's just really kind of breathtaking. And my brother restored this in early 2000s, and I did some restoration work a little bit later when they did a complete restoration of the dome. And one of the kind of jewels, I think, of the city. Another one of my favorites, obviously, the Ellie Public Library. And this room is fantastic with all the murals. That piece hangs right in the middle. And it's hard to fathom, but that's a 9-foot diameter globe. And so you can imagine how high up and how big that space is. But it represents the universe, that piece. And the idea was Goodhue, who's the architect, and was actually built by Lee Laurie, you see here. Lee Laurie did the Atlas Shrugged at Rockefeller Center and the ironwork around. And you can see here the zodiac kind of encircling the globe. And there's a sunburst painted on the top, and then there's a moon in the chain that comes down along with some gold stars. You can kind of see the gold stars around the perimeter there. Now, Judson, like I mentioned Tiffany earlier, well, there was an artist named Frederick Wilson who designed this window. And Frederick Wilson was Tiffany's lead designer for a number of years, the liturgical designer. And he came to California in 1923 to do an installation of Tiffany mosaic. And he came right kind of in the winter of, I think it was December or January. And he realized, wait, why am I not living here? You know, the weather. He realized he didn't have to wear a coat. He loved the weather. He was ready for a change. And so he sent for his family and moved actually right behind the studio. He lived behind this Judson Studios in the 20s. I think one of the most important designers of stained glass in the country. And this window at All Saints is in the choir loft. And there's 2 transept windows in this church that are also designed by Frederick Wilson, but when he was working for Tiffany. And so if you're in Pasadena, if you haven't been to All Saints, it's worth a visit to see the wonderful glass. And as you can see, we restored that window in 2013. And so while most of the work you see is very traditional, coming into the 20s, Frank Lloyd Wright kind of came to Los Angeles in the mid-20s and worked at the Barnsdale for I think Barnsdale and the Hollyhock House, which are these windows, which Judson did originally. Frank Lloyd Wright, some say if he only designed windows, he would be known for as a famous stained glass designer. So not only was he obviously a marvelous architect, but great at designing stained glass. And so Judson did these windows. We also did some restoration work on them as well. And then, of course, the Ennis House, which is up the hill. Now, this story is a little bit more complicated, and I go into this in the book because it's unclear where these windows designs came from. By the time the windows were commissioned by the Ennises, Frank Lloyd Wright had been fired from the job. And so he was no longer working there. But I go into the theory about where these designs came from. We know they're Judson because we have the invoices for these windows, but we don't know exactly who designed them. And but I'm sure there was some direction from Mrs. Ennis because she gave a lot of direction on this project throughout. We've also done restoration work on these windows. The views up there are fantastic. Having done the original windows and the restoration for the Frank Lloyd Wright windows here, got us in an invitation to work on the Unity Temple restoration project in 2018. And here you see our crew getting ready to remove some windows. And this job was a complete restoration. We took all the windows out, shipped them to Los Angeles, took them completely apart because there had been so many bad kind of repairs to them over the years that we had to recame them. And rather than, Frank Lloyd Wright didn't use lead, which we still use today to hold the pieces of glass together, but he preferred zinc because it was a stiffer metal. It kept its edges much cleaner because, as you see, all of his work was very geometric. And once we pulled all these windows out and signed the contract, our zinc supplier went out of business. And so we were kind of left scrambling, looking for zinc all over the country. Luckily, a company up in Canada bought all the machines of the company that closed down. It took them forever to refurbish these machines while we were trying to get this work done. But they were able to eventually recreate the zinc for this project. And so it was kind of a dramatic process, but ultimately the right thing to do. And it's a really beautiful space. Here you see the restored space. Yeah, they got back all the original colors and finishes in the space. You see the wonderful skylight up there at the top and those clear story windows. And then this is in the school, which is just next to the temple. Again, great skylights and a beautiful space. So this was it was a real honor to be able to be involved with this project and be able to restore these windows. And the great thing about restoration is you always learn something. Another important restoration project recently was the Wilshire Boulevard Temple, which is right there, obviously on Wilshire Boulevard. And Judson did not do these windows originally. It came from a stained glass designer out of Pennsylvania. But these windows were pretty unique for a temple because they're almost kind of this Neo-Gothic look, which was fairly rare. But a lot of these, the congregants of the temple were involved with the Hollywood studios, and so they got these amazing. You see the paintings up above there, so the decorations. And if you haven't been inside this building, it's worth a visit when you can get inside. Now, in the 30s, when Judson, it was really the Depression, and most commissions dried up. So a lot of the churches, interestingly, this is one of the patterns that I found in doing the research of the book, is that so many churches were being built from the early 1900s up until the 1920s, and then they just kind of lost all of their budget. So the stained glass was not being commissioned. And so many of the projects that we see of the churches being commissioned, designing the stained glass, and then everything just shutting down. And we really don't see those commissions pick up until after World War II. So Judson had to kind of go and be creative and find work. One of them was for the, we're back now in Inglewood. This is a different mausoleum. This is the Inglewood Mausoleum. The Mausoleum of the Golden West. And so you can see all of the square footage on those skylights. Really impressive. There's so much glass. If you have not been to Inglewood Mausoleum, again, another visit. I'll give you a list here of places to see. And at the end of each of these kind of hallways, or these long corridors in the mausoleum, were these scenes of famous nature spots in California. This being Half Dome in Yosemite. And so it's a really beautiful space, and these windows are still there. Also, another kind of Depression era project were the memorial windows for the fallen soldiers that went to LA Public High School. And this is the library, the memorial library. And these are really kind of, beautifully painted traditional windows for those. You see the names in the center, 2 panels there at the bottom. For those students who attended LA High School. And this is you can see some of the great painting and symbolism there of the subjects that they studied. You see in the background, the wheel turning, those were represented the subjects that those students studied. And then obviously the symbol of the federal government and the state government, and we have the different armed forces. So now, I mentioned these projects coming after World War II. And so now in the 1950s, a lot of the projects that we were doing were this Neo-Gothic design, which you see here. And St. James Episcopal Church in South Pasadena is a good example of that. Also a Goodhue building. So the architect who did the LA Central Library also did this church. And the windows were really not commissioned. The rose window was early, but then the rest of the windows were not commissioned until the 1950s. And that's the same with like LA First Congregational Church. If you know that, 6 by MacArthur Park, all windows that were done after the war. And most of them, I should say. And so this Neo-Gothic kind of era, I attribute to two things. One, because of the architecture, like I mentioned. And then secondly, a lot of the GIs, a lot of the armed service folks had been in Europe, right? And they're kind of exposed to this architecture, European architecture. And so the Neo-Gothic kind of sentiment, I think, kind of resonated with them. And so that's what we see here in the 1950s going on. That being said, there was a big push for a lot of the military commissions. This is the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs that my grandfather did. One of my grandfather's favorite projects. Here you can see it at night. It's a spectacular building. And even on the inside, you can see how these kind of rays of light kind of shine through. And we're actually working on the restoration of this. This building's going under a complete renovation. They are setting scaffold now. I was actually there a week ago, climbing on scaffold. So that tip of that roof, I was that high on the scaffold. It was quite interesting to be high in the space. But we were documenting all the windows, getting ready to pull them out. We'll be pulling them out at the beginning of next year and completely cleaning them, restoring them, and then they'll be reinstalled in about 3 or 4 years out. A little bit later, I'm moving into the 70s. This is my father's project, the Tropicana Hotel and Casino. This was the largest barrel dome in the world at one point, and it's completely suspended. It's really interesting because they were still doing nuclear testing out in the desert at that time, and so the casinos would get the occasional jolt. And so this is almost like a suspended frame that's holding all of that glass, and so it can wiggle just a little bit for all of that. And then you can actually walk on the sides. There's two-way mirrors that you can look through those mirrors. And that might have been before they got the elaborate camera systems that you see in the center, running down the center of those windows. But this is kind of an interesting project. My father did a lot of domes at that time. This was kind of a lot of the 70s were kind of a boom period, and Vegas especially. We did a lot of work in the 70s. And then, but really my father loved working with churches. One of his largest projects was here at the Mary Queen of the Universe Shrine in Orlando, Florida. It's these windows. This is one of, I think, 14 windows that were about 12 by 18 feet high about. And these were a multi-year project. It took them several years to do these projects. And interestingly for me, these are some of the first windows that I worked on growing up. So in my summers, I worked at Judson cutting glass. And so I remember working on these windows vividly. And so this is where I'm really kind of starting to get more exposure to what's going on in the stained glass world and what Judson is doing. But at that same time, what I saw out there were projects like this. And so I'm taking you back to Germany for a minute. Schaffrath is a kind of one of the earliest German masters, we call them, of working in post-war Germany to do a lot of work like this. So you can imagine these in the 80s were pretty cutting edge. And so while we were doing still a lot of traditional figurative work, I was also seeing a lot of this work being done in Germany. And even as recently as 2013, Guy Kemper is out of Kentucky, but as an American artist, he goes to Germany to get his work done. And so a lot of public art work being done by American artists, they're going to Germany. And so that to me was something like, wow, that doesn't seem right. We should be able to work with those artists here in the United States and figure out how we can attract them. And so there was kind of a business competitive side to me, also keeping an eye on what was going on. And so I realized that we really need to kind of think about where projects are going to be coming from the future and how to expand our own market, because the Germans are very good at working like this. This is what we call flash glass, which is a very thin layer of blue on top of clear. And so if you expose it to acid, those areas, they create that white and these amazing textures and transitions of color. You can see it on the yellow and the green glass as well. And that's the acid work that they became very well known for. And so these were techniques that I looked at quite a bit. And at that same time, look at the work that we're doing here in Judson. So you see these very contemporary, abstract public artworks where Judson is doing this kind of thing. And so that's fine. We said, look, let's embrace this. And so I really work with Tim Carey, who I mentioned earlier, to really work on honing our own skills of painting and mastering kind of these traditional designs and elements. And we really enjoyed that. We learned a lot. And that led us to this project, which is at the Our Savior Parish at USC, the new Catholic Center there. And this was 8 large windows, and then you see some windows back in the apse there at the very back. And these were all completely hand painted. This project led to 2 important things. One was it finally led us to start designing on the computer. And so we were using Wacom tablets to draw on these, to get these images in. And we would take digital photographs, drop the figures, of the figures kind of in costume, drop them into our compositions, and then draw on them to create the stained glass working drawings. And so that really pushed us into the computer age, where we had kind of been resistant earlier on. But these windows are so large; they're about 13 feet by about 26 feet high, and we needed to do them quickly. And so the computer was absolutely necessary. The second thing we did is we collaborated with artists here. This is a Gail Garner-Roski design. She's a watercolorist. And she took all the flowers that we had used in all the other windows and put them in this one rose window. And so we were able to take her design, convert it into a stained glass design. And then we also introduced fusing, which I'm about to take you into the world of fusing. But those flowers, if you can see the multicolor on those flowers, that's something that was kind of groundbreaking for us at that time. So here you can see Tim working on the Wacom tablet there on his lap. We've got the figures in the design, and he's actually sketching those out. So by sketching them into the computer, we could print them out to full size. So you see the full size on the wall there. That's what we call a full size cartoon. Generally, that used to be done by hand as well. So you can imagine doing all of the sketching on a piece of paper, making any changes or that kind of thing was very laborious. And then, but by doing it in the computer, it was super easy to make changes and adjust things. And then when it came to creating the working drawings or the full-size cartoons, we could just print them out. We didn't have to actually hand draw all those. So what that allowed us to do is spend more time on the painting on the glass. So you see the lion there on the table. Manny's that's Manny painting on the surface of the glass. And so the painting is a little bit different. The color in stained glass is already in the glass, but when you paint on it, you're basically creating shading or dark lines, which gives us the detail. So and then that would get fired. But here you can kind of see how wonderful they are in the windows. And that's using some enamel work, and then the flash glass work you see in the flowers in the lower left-hand corner there, and the tree in the background. We really used a lot of traditional and contemporary techniques to create these windows. Now, this is kind of a next phase of this talk is a phone call we got that really changes everything for us. And so it was around Christmas time, and the phone was ringing. The artist Tim picked it up, and it was an architect who said, "Hey, how big can you make a stained glass window?" Like, well, that's a great question. We love those kind of questions. So Tim kind of walked him through a little bit how that works. And what he was calling about was this project. And this is the Church of the Resurrection in Leawood. And they wanted to talk to us about creating this window for this very contemporary space. But look at that window. That window is, when it was originally designed, was 90 by 45 feet. And so it ended up being the entire thing. That's just a placeholder, obviously. This is some of the conceptual work that they showed us early on. But that was a 3,400 square foot window, about the size of a basketball court. And they did an international search for stained glass studios to commission this project too. And we were the finalists along with Scott Parsons and the Germans. And so here we are having, kind of come together, seeing a project that was bringing the contemporary glass world and the kind of the traditional glass world together. And so we knew when they were going through the selection process, there had to be some conflict among the selection committee about those that wanted something very contemporary and those that wanted something very traditional. And so what we did is we said, look, it's going to be easier for us to move into the contemporary realm than for them to move into the traditional realm. And so we took everything that we had learned with the computer and some of the designing that we were able to do from USC and really kind of apply that. And we came up with this design. And we only had, I think, 2 weeks to come up with this design. And this is based off a narrative that the pastor gave us. And being the Church of the Resurrection, obviously the resurrected Christ was the main figure. And on the left-hand side, you see the garden. He also wanted a garden theme. So on the left is the Garden of Eden. In the center, the Resurrection Garden. And on the right, the Revelation, the Garden of Revelation. And so this was our very initial design. And then this is where it ended up. And so you can see one of the things that intrigued them and why I think they went with us is because we showed them when we presented to them what we could do with the computer and how we could adapt designs and make things kind of, really interactive. And so the pastor being a very strong personality and, he built this church from 20 people to 20,000 people. And so he really had a vision of what he wanted. And so we were able to work with him to come up with this design. And so there you can kind of see it dropped in conceptually where we were going with it. And that's, kind of gives you a sense of the size and the scale of it. And that's a real size school bus. So you imagine that court is that window is the size of a basketball court. And so it really took a lot of planning. And it was hard to think about because we'd never really seen a window this size before, of one kind of narrative scene. And so it was really tricky. And so we had designed something really, in all honesty, that we didn't know exactly how to make. And so worked with Tim to kind of play around with a lot of the flash glass that I was telling you about to kind of look if we can create a lot of transitions to create this kind of contemporary feel to this figurative design. And then one day Tim said, hey, he was flipping through a magazine. He saw, hey, this guy named Narcissus Quagliata is giving a class, and I think I should go, meet with him. And I said, that's great. Why don't you go see that? Well, we knew who Narcissus Quagliata was, and this is the work of Narcissus Quagliata. And he's kind of a maverick in the stained glass world. He's done an amazing kind of work, kind of broken all the rules. And we thought, wow, if we could get him to help us out, this would be a really interesting, intriguing thing. And we knew, obviously, he could work at a massive scale. This is a project that a dome he did for a subway station in Taiwan. And it was 7,000 square feet. So this is twice the size of what we were looking at. So we knew if we could get him to help, he could really, kind of not only help us logistically, but also in terms of thinking about the aesthetics of the whole large piece. I'll get into that. So I want to tell you a little bit about Narcissus. This is Narcissus on the right-hand side there. This is up at Pilchuck School. I guess they used to kind of get dressed up in crazy outfits one night during the summer events. And Narcissus on the right is leaning on Dale Chihuly. So you may not recognize Dale Chihuly there. That's before the eye patch. But if you know Dale Chihuly, he started and was kind of the impetus of the Pilchuck Art School up in Washington. And so he hired Narcissus to come up and teach stained glass at Pilchuck. And, this is the first of three concepts I want to kind of introduce is hot glass. And so you're all familiar with glass blowing, right? And Pilchuck is where people go really to learn and hone their skills in glass blowing. And as you see in 1971, this is an early shot of Dale Chihuly, who really made it famous. And Dale blow pieces like this, right? And this is what he was known for. This is the early 80s. But Narcissus was a flat glass artist. He was a stained glass artist. He worked in 2D, where Dale Chihuly was working in 3D. But having worked the summers teaching up at Pilchuck, Narcissus would have been exposed to all the glass blowing and what they were doing in glass blowing. And so he was really intrigued with the amazing effects they could get, right, in all these colorful single sheets of glass. And so Narcissus would, have these kind of designs with explosions of color and really kind of unconventional at the time. This is all in the 80s. And so what he did working with the glass blowers, he started, okay, well, look, if you can do all these amazing effects in the glass, he started designing rondelles. And so if you know rondelles, they're spun off of the blowpipe to create, flat surfaces. And so Narcissus started using these colored frits that you see here on what's called the Marver table on the right. So that's a steel table where glass could be spread out. And then you would take the what they call a gather of glass. You see the molten glass there. That's molten glass pulled out of the kiln and then rolled onto that glass, right? And so you roll that hot glass onto all these bits of glass and they stick to it. There you can see it stuck to the gather. And then Narcissus was also taking hot glass and wrapping it around these gathers of glass while they were working it. There you can kind of see this wonderful kind of combination of colors. You see the dark and then the orange and then the stripes in the orange. So here's this kind of wonderful movement of different colors in glass that then they would blow, right? See, they're blowing that and spinning it. So that gather now is being blown into this flat surface. And he could get these elements to it. You see these rondelles have these amazing details. And that's really what he wanted to create, was this kind of, you see that one piece of glass where he could create these really great transitions of color. And so he started taking those rondelles and incorporating them into his work. You see all the rondelles laid out there on the left-hand side, and then incorporated into one of his leaded panels on the right. But what he was really after was these bits of glass that he could get these wonderful transitions of color. And so he could incorporate them by cutting them up and then using them in this panel that I showed you earlier. And so he would take those bits, and so he could get these really interesting combinations of color. The problem was that they were extremely difficult to make. And so you can see, if you're familiar at all with the leading process or the glazing process of stained glass, it's very labor intensive, and it's all done by hand. And you can see, if you look closely, all that shiny lead, it's really windy and crazy. And to get the shapes and the effects he was going for just kind of became too laborious. And so he started kind of looking around, exploring options. And in the 70s, this company called Bullseye Glass started working with warm glass. So Chihuly, Pilchuck, glass blowing, that's hot glass. Warm glass, now we're in Portland, and Bullseye was in Portland, Oregon. And Bullseye started working in what we call warm glass, which means that you could put glass in a kiln and at cold, put it into a kiln, stack it, do any different kinds of effects, fuse that glass together, and get a lot of the shapes and movement that you wanted through the heat process. But in the 70s and the early 80s was very crude. So here you see, this is them experimenting. This is Narcissus putting a lot of glass on a sheet, right? And then sticking it into the oven there. You see that the hot kind of oven on the left-hand side there. He would stick it in there, heat it up, pull it out, and manipulate it. So he's got a steel rod there where he's moving the glass around on that flat surface. So now see, he's working in a flat sheet of glass rather than a spun rondelle, giving him a little bit more flexibility. And this was here you see in '93, kind of his early experiments with Bullseye and fusing, and that's a head. So you see the shoulders there at the bottom. And so so he saw it. He kind of was not super enthused by it. It still had a long way to go, but it was a little crude, but it showed some promise. And so Narcissus went back to the Bay Area, where he was located, based out of the Bay Area, and he worked with a guy named David Ruth. And David Ruth was doing a lot of his own experimentation with fusing glass and working with molten glass. And there you see kind of sticking the rod in the glass, so they get the glass really, so it's in its molten shape, and then start mixing it around with these rods to create the effects they were going for. And then these are the heads they came up with. So you can see kind of just in a year, 2 years from that first kind of crude head to this, it is really kind of interesting, beautiful movement in the glass. And so this kind of idea of working with the figure too, and being able to scale it up. So in '95, Narcissus made this piece, and this is kind of the first major large piece of fused glass. And so there's this kind of promise of it being able to work in an architectural setting. So not only was he working in the figurative elements, but he could scale it up. And so that was what intrigued us about him. And here you see he continued working on the heads, '99. And then in 2011, he started playing around with paint, right? So the vitreous paint that I showed you, Manny painting the lion, for example, well, combining the painting with the fusing really allowed you to kind of control more figurative elements. And so he started playing around a lot with that. So these pieces really intrigued us. We thought, wow, just think about where we can take this. And there you see a lot of the molten glass and then the frits that I'll explain in a little bit. Anyway, so these pieces we were kind of observing. We kind of blew us away. Always wondered, how does he make this stuff? We had no clue how he would make this stuff. So anyway, Tim went up and took a class with Narcissus. Here's Narcissus at the class. This is in Denver, Colorado. And Tim showed him the design and said, look, we'd love to collaborate with you. We want to make a window infused glass. And so he said, well, let me see it. And he showed it to him. And he looked at it and he says, wait, now how big is it? He said, oh, it's 90 by 40 feet. It's the size of a basketball court. He's like, well, how are you going to make it? I said, well, that's why I'm here. I wanted to talk to you about that. Well, you only have 3 days. And so, yeah, he said, that's why we want you to come to Los Angeles and help us put this window together. So he was intrigued. I think he was at a point in his career where he wanted to kind of test his own abilities. And so we got him down to Los Angeles. This is in our studio. He really studied and assessed the design, and we started making samples immediately. And so we started playing around with different ideas and concepts. And I think he was trying to convince himself whether this was something that he could do and help us with. And but we quickly realized that we needed Bullseye's help. And so we went up to Portland. This is Dan Shore. He's the owner of Bullseye, one of the founders of the company. And we said, look, we really want to make this window, but we need some technical assistance. And they said, great, we'll help you out. And so Tim and Narcissus both went up to Portland, and then they made this window. So this is the first window that we made out of fused glass. And we made this partly for our own exploration, but also the pastor had to raise the money to pay for the window. And so we made this window for him. But look at all these wonderful colors and the combination of the painting. So the eyes you see are actually hand painted on, and then all the different colors that are spread through. And so we realized, wow, this is really, we have some great potential here. The problem was that we're in a 120-year-old building now, right? And so this building couldn't take all the kilns and everything necessary to fuse glass. And so when we came back from Portland, convinced that this is the way we wanted to go, we said, okay, we need to figure out how we're going to be able to really take fusing on in earnest. And that meant moving to a separate facility. And so we found this facility over in South Pasadena. It's just a couple blocks away from our original facility there. And this is where we could build out the studio and put in all the kilns and really get to work. And so here's Tim and Narcissus. It was my job to make sure they could get this job done. And so I had to create a facility for them to work in. So I want to walk you a little bit through the Frit process and why I think this is such a game changer for the stained glass industry. Now, it's been around since the 70s, really kind of kicks in the 80s, and then they don't perfect it until the 90s. But it's never really been embraced fully by the stained glass industry. And so that was one of the impetuses of the book as well. It's like, well, why has no one really done this before? And really the question is because the technology wasn't there. It wasn't until Bullseye really created what we call compatible glasses. And so by making all of their colors, what we say compatible, where you could put them in the kiln, heat them up, cool them, and they remain stable. If you take that with the traditional colored glass that we use in traditional leaded glass, that glass would stress itself out and crack over time. And so Bullseye really came up with the technology to make all of their colors compatible. So we had the comfort of knowing that if we created a piece and fused it, that it would remain stable over time, right? Because glass is a very long-term endeavor. And so here I'll walk you through a little bit of just one piece. So this lion, for example, is a combination of the fritting and the fusing, and we used lead lines. So in theory, we didn't have to use lead lines where you see all the kind of the lines running through it. But they wanted the lead lines. Like I said, they had traditional elements on their selection committee. And you can compare that to the line I showed you earlier at USC. So see how kind of smooth and you see some transition of color, but not major, right? It's a fairly traditional painted versus all the kind of complexity that you see in the fused lion. And so what we were doing is that we were taking clear glass, we'd paint on the base. So Tim would paint these eyes and all the details kind of on a base sheet of clear glass, which was Bullseye Glass, obviously, because we had to work with compatible glasses. And then we would cut colored glass and lay it on top of there is what we call the descriptive glass. We lay it on top of the clear and the paint. And then we would apply the frit. And so the frit is basically just ground up glass. It's like anywhere from a powder to a small gravel. It's like 4 different sizes, gradually getting a little bit larger. And we would take that frit and spread it on the top of the cut glass and the clear glass and the painting, and then we could get this detail. And so you see, imagine that eye of the lion, all of that kind of color and variation that you see, and the possibilities that we kind of started thinking about. This is a galaxy. Narcissus is kind of known for his galaxies. He kind of led the design on this and the fabrication, a little bit of a different process, where we would take the frit and spread it in the kiln and create like these big brush strokes almost. And these brush strokes gave us a kind of a movement in the glass. And so you see this is still on the kiln shelf. It's been fired. The frit's been spread to create these shapes. And it's really beautiful. And so we could take that frit and lay it out after it's been fired and piece it together on the clear glass, similar to what I just showed you with the lion, and get these amazing effects. So see the movement of the transitions of color, and really, realizing, wow, this is really kind of something that we're just scratching the surface of, and kind of the sky's the limit. And these are some of the details of the flowers that we did in a poppy. Coming from California, we had to put some California poppies in there, and of course the sunflowers for Missouri, Kansas City, right? And then the last thing is the Christ head, which was the most important piece, and I think probably the most groundbreaking piece. And so this was pieces where we were actually making raw materials. So if you look at the table on the right-hand side there, all the movement in the glass, that we custom made all of those pieces. And then Tim and Narcissus would cut those pieces and lay them out on the face that you see kind of coming together. They're almost like a mosaic. So these cut pieces laid on top of each other, you see them there kind of being laid out. And look at all that, kind of transition of color laid out on the face. And it's basically like a mosaic. And they would take those pieces. It was broken up into, maybe 8 to 12 pieces. I can't remember now. And then fire them together. And so you see kind of these amazing effects. And I think, this is, to me, I think one of the most exciting pieces I've seen come out of the glass world anywhere. I think this is really going to change how we make glass. So really all of these things we were kind of able to experiment, because we had 161 panels to make in Kansas City. And so we were able to really experiment with a lot of different things, use some different techniques. Here you can kind of see that during the installation process, the scale of it, and there it is installed. And we delivered on time, by the way. It was quite the journey. So while that window was being made and we were seeing, these kind of amazing techniques and things that we can do, the question was, well, where do we go from here? Now we've invested in a new studio. This project's going to wrap up. How do we keep that studio open, and how do we keep kind of exploring this fusing thing? And so that was kind of my process of thinking about. Well, the first thing was to keep Narcissus around. So Narcissus spends about half the year at our studio exploring. This is a design that he made. And I showed you his dome out of Taiwan. Well, this is the first dome that he's made that's completely fused glass. So this is all fused, all custom made glass for a dome in a kind of in an atrium. And that's the ceiling of it. We're still waiting to get some shots. These were taken during construction, but this is a really beautiful piece that I think we have a lot of possibilities for. The second thing was that we wanted to start bringing in outside artists, and maybe painters or artists who didn't necessarily work in stained glass. And so some of the earliest ones that respond were street artists, believe it or not. And so the muralist David Flores did an early piece with us. That's him. I love that shot of him. This is called I think the Street Painter. And this is a piece that he made that went up to the Sullivan Goss Gallery up in Santa Barbara. And so, I love this idea too of not only taking glass, from architectural spaces, but also then the possibility of moving them into the gallery space. And then we started looking for more artists. Amir Falla actually lives up the street from our studio in Highland Park. We started visiting artists, and Amir was really intrigued and put this piece together. This is a self-portrait, actually. And he does these kind of coverings and beautiful fabrics, and then personal items that each of these figures. So you see that sock monkey there, and look at all the little kind of what we call frit balls. So we made these little balls of glass that we could put on top of the monkey to give it texture. So if you run your fingers over it, it's actually a textured piece of glass. And he could paint on it. And also he liked the traditional elements of too. So not only is that fused fabric, but then there's the traditional leaded around it, which is something that really intrigued him. And then he liked that. He did this piece. He made actually a series of these, and these have been selling in galleries for him. And so not only were we working with fine artists and galleries, but then we also wanted to enter in the public art realm, right? So like I mentioned to you, the Germans had kind of ruled this market, even taking American artists to work in Germany. And we really saw some possibilities with this fusing element to go into public art. And so this is an early project. We're working with Michael Davis, who's a very experienced public artist. And he did these lilies like a box. So you're looking through 2 layers of glass there. You can kind of see the shadows of the lilies. It's a really beautiful piece. Anne Elizabeth, another public art project. We worked with her on the firehouse at Santa Clarita. And so she would come in and do some of the painting, and we worked from her designs. And so these were some amazing pieces. You can see there's no lead in here. So this is just this kind of tree on fire for firehouse. The firemen love to see fire, engage with it. So this was a piece that we actually just installed just a couple of months ago. And so these are in the Santa Clarita firehouse. Sarah Kane, also another Highland Park artist, believe it or not, came to us with a public art project that she had won at SFO. And she's an abstract painter and really loved kind of the movement and the play of the glass, the color. And she had a 150-foot wall at SFO that she commissioned us to do and work with her. And so she kind of created these wonderful kind of wall of glass that stretches through. This is a new construction at the airport. I think it's a Hyatt hotel. You see the check-in there on the left-hand side. James Jeans, another artist. He's over on the west side. He originally designed that center, the skeleton in the center, and then that was for a commission project. It fell through, and then I went back to him and I said, James, let's make that window, but let's put it in a triptych. And so he came up with these other 2 pieces to go with it. Again, combining the fusing with the leading. And he loved that project so much, and we talked about doing a 3-dimensional piece that he created this 3-dimensional kind of framework. And you see the model there is discussing it with James. And that's the finished piece there. And so we light that from the interior. It's a really amazing piece when you walk around. That's all fused glass combined with some leading. There it is all laid out. And James loved that one so much, he's now designing this, and we're actually starting to build this. It doesn't have a home yet. We're still looking for a home. But this is a piece that we wanted people to be able to walk into and look out. So so during the day, like during this shot, there'd be an opening on it. You'd be able to walk through it and look out into the natural light. And then at night, we could light it from the interior. And, it would be, hopefully in a spot that could be seen from miles around, be like a beacon. And so we're really excited about this piece coming together. Hopefully next year it'll be completed. Now, one of the things working with these artists is that we really realized that our own staff really needed to understand, our own artists, designers, our technicians really needed to understand the material itself. And so Narcissus and I came up with a plan to work with our own core group of artisans to work on a certain number of projects. So we assigned them each a plein air painting, actually from the California Art Club. If you know the California Art Club, they're contemporary plein air painters. And we gave each of them a painting to create the window for. And so they went to work. Here you see one of the Peter Adams pieces, and convert that into glass, matte, and Quentin worked on this one. So you can see kind of that pre-made material. So this is a combination of these techniques that we learned in the Kansas City project combining pre-made material with painting and frit, laying these out on the panels. And there you see the finished piece of that. Carl Dempwolf's kelp beds, one of my favorite pieces. And Reed did a little bit of a different technique. We picked four very different paintings to force each of our artisans to work in very different techniques, and but at the same time, all assessing each other and looking at each other's work and seeing how they could learn from each other. And a Stephen Curry piece. And Indra, our star painter, worked on this one. There you see it translated into glass. And lastly, a Robin Purcell is almost like an abstract painting. Andrea worked on this one. Again, totally different technique, combining all those things. And there's the four of them. And so this is in our studio, in our new studio. And we still have them there. We're trying to, we enjoyed having them in the studio, and we look at them every day and love them. And these are going to be installed in the Inglewood Mausoleum that I showed you earlier. So, this almost a little over 100 years now of work. And so it's really interesting to see those landscapes with the landscapes we've just made. And so we're really excited to see those kind of come together. So I hope I've changed your concept of what stained glass is and what it's going to be. And in a lot of my research, in terms of working with artists, I realize all of these, if you look at all of these names, all of these artists worked in glass. You may not know that. They worked in glass at some point. Most of them late in their careers, and most of them kind of regretted not being able to get started earlier in their careers because they found the beauty of glass. And for me, I think about, wow, what would these artists do if they had the possibility of fusing? And so that's kind of, to me, a very exciting potential moving forward and what artists can do in glass. In fact, here's this artist. We couldn't quite get him in the fusing mode, but he recently finished the Queen's window at Westminster Abbey. And so if Hockney's making stained glass, right, we have some really interesting places to go with that. And Hockney's, designed this on an iPad. It's very traditional in terms of technique, with just the traditional glass that's hand cut and laid out. And, so even changing perceptions of fine artists is something that I think that we need to achieve. And, I think part of it is that there's a little bit of a, doing a window for Westminster Abbey, you with the Queen looking over your shoulder, I think you probably want to stick to some conservative elements to it, right? That I think he was not necessarily wanting to experiment. But being here in LA, the woman who made the window for him actually came and worked with us and put a fused window together. And so she's out of York, England, and she came to Los Angeles to work on a fused window. And so, hopefully when she collaborates again, we can see some fusing incorporated into the windows. But and I think what's kind of so interesting about this too is that not only is this, so this is in England, the cathedral's in England, and this is last year. And here, this is Narcissus' piece from 2001 at the Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And so it kind of, goes to show how, while we are known for our traditional work in California, I think we can also expect some very kind of surprises and some exciting things here on the West Coast. And I think California is at the kind of forefront in terms of pushing this technology forward. And so I'm really excited to see where it goes. So I just want to wrap up. I want to tell you that we have an exhibition coming up at Forest Lawn Museum. If you're familiar with the museum, they are tentatively opening up in October. We've delivered the pieces over there. Obviously, with the circumstances, everything's kind of gone a little haywire. But the Forest Lawn Museum has an amazing stained glass collection. You can kind of see a variation of Judson work from our earliest projects to these artist collaborations are going to be at this exhibition. So keep that on your radar. It's going to be worth seeing. So I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for the LA Public Library. Thank you for the opportunity of speaking with you all. Again, thank you to Angel City Press, and thank you, Steffi Nelson, for helping me put this book together. And I would be happy to take any questions if there's any questions out there.
Thank you so much, David. That was an amazing presentation. Photographs really beautiful. I can't wait to get a copy of this book and page through it. I'll just put it in the chat too. The book will be available for pre-order through the library store. You could get it online. And your purchases at the library store help support the library. And of course, we will have copies to check out. I believe the book has not been released yet?
Yes, it's released. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So you should. I tried finding it in our catalog. I'm sure we'll be getting plenty of copies. We'll
get you one.
Yeah. We'll have copies to check out. So check our catalog in a little while. Happy to take any questions. So please put your questions in the chat. Let me see if we've got some questions. Well, somebody was asking, actually. Obviously, we're in a unique situation still. Marjorie was saying she visited your old studio twice, and it was an amazing experience. And she was asking if you're going to offer tours in your new location, if you have any plans for that.
Yeah, we do have tours in both locations. Unfortunately, right with the circumstances, we've canceled all of our tours for the near term. But when things get back to normal or somewhat normal, we do tours once a month in both locations. So if you sign up for a tour, we'll take you to both the original studio and the new facility.
Oh, cool.
They're very close to each other.
Yeah. And somebody else was saying they need to take a road trip to see all these pieces. I mean, there's very few things if it seems like you don't have a hand in Los Angeles. So many of these iconic spaces. Again, things are closed right now. I mean, what's a good way to see some examples of this work? Are there good places that are actually open right now that people could check out?
That's a good question. I really don't know. I mean, you can see, I don't know if you can get in the Natural History Museum or the library, right? Everything's kind of shut down right now. Some of the churches may be open around town. You can look that up.
Just reminding me we can see Memorial Branch from the outside.
Yeah, that's true.
Check out an LAPL location.
And
you can also check out, I was going to say we have a new 360 tour of Central Library on our website. So check that out because that's got some amazing, you can do a 3D tour of the inside of the rotunda and see our chandelier.
Yeah, it's a strange time, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know what's open. But yeah, that is one of the exciting things that I saw in the book was how we could how we saw the Judson Glass kind of in these really interesting spaces that's kind of unexpected, right? And you kind of don't know it until you go inside and see it there. And maybe you've seen it before and you just didn't really realize. So it's kind of fun.
Yeah. One of the pieces that you were showing was reminding me of this kind of unique quality of stained glass where it has it's a direct relationship with light, obviously.
Right.
And it consequently also has this quality, I mean, compared to like a mural or a painting, of not only being something that you look at and observe, but something that impacts the space that you're in. If you're in a space that has a stained glass window, it's influencing the environment. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of that connection with light.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, it's all about the light. So stained glass is, the beauty of it is that is one of the few art forms, right, that the light can pass through it, and you can kind of, the idea of you're working with transmitted light as opposed to like a painting you see in a museum is reflected light. And so the beauty of that is that it changes, all through the day. If you're with natural light, it does affect the space. Like you say, it can throw color onto the floor. It really does affect the mood of the space. And it's really important. And that's why we always, when we're working in an architectural context, is to really understand the space, what it's being used for, what direction the sunlight's coming from. But there's really nothing like light coming through colored glass. Even if you think about with plastic or any of the materials, there's something about the natural elements of glass that create this kind of intriguing kind of aura, so to speak. And that is extremely important. The light is what it's all about.
Yeah. Actually, a couple of people kind of asking about how you identify artists that you want to work with. How do you get connected with artists?
Yes, we reach out to artists that we find maybe online or have been, for example, in public art experience. So Melissa in our office kind of does all the kind of looking for artists and trying to develop those. A lot of times they come from referrals. Artists who are primarily painters. We usually are looking for painters who have a sense of color and this idea of light and are like we were talking earlier of wanting to kind of you see kind of those artists that might naturally kind of evolve into stained glass. And so we're working with them on private commissions, gallery exhibitions, and public art. So public art's a real big push in terms of collaborating with those artists. And those artists, the beauty of the public art realm is that it provides a different venue for artists who are painters, for example. You can't necessarily put a painting in a public space all the time. And so glass is a great alternative for that.
Let's see if we've got some more questions here. Lots of compliments on the book. People excited to check it out and maybe purchase it. Some folks saying, Jenny saying she used to know some folks who worked there in the 70s.
Oh, yeah. Good.
Luis was a librarian there. Do you have a librarian on
we do not now. Yeah, we had an archivist and librarian on staff, but no longer.
Yeah. Sounds like maybe a potential crossover.
Yeah.
Well, David, we're a little past 1 o'clock, so maybe that's a good place to wrap it up. Let me, I put the link in the chat. Like I said, if you're interested in ordering a copy of the book, you can do so through the Library Foundation bookstore and help support the library. David, I was wondering if you had any parting words to leave us with or anything else
Not
you want
today.
to say?
Everyone stay healthy out there. And again, thanks for joining me. And please buy a book. You'll really enjoy it.
Thanks so much, David. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Neil.